Hello, everyone. This is John Greenlee, and I thought what I would do is to briefly review what we've covered so far. I do want to say thank you again for being a part of this class. I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussions that we've had, and I also just want to invite you at any time if you'd like to get in touch with me, you want to discuss this in more depth, I'd be more than happy to do that. So let's get started. At the very beginning, we talked about how just by the nature of the subject, we have to narrow this down and kind of take a very broad look at uh, the subject of religion, world religion, East and West, and just by example, Christianity. If we were to take on a study of Christianity, we'd probably divide it up this way. There's three main branches: Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. And then we talked a little bit about unorthodox sects that they kind of got one foot in and one foot out. They don't fit completely into what most people would define as Christianity. And also, just a reminder when we talked about what is orthodoxy, we define it as it's what most of the people have believed for most of the time. And so, by that definition, there's certain sects that would not fit in that category. And if we were to look at denominations, for example, within Protestantism, there are literally thousands of those, and so it'd be very difficult to even get your arms around that subject. And so when we look at some of the other religions as a whole, just keep in mind we're barely going to touch on the fundamental ideas behind them. There's only so much we can do in a class like this. But with that in mind, here's the timeline, and here are the seven major world religions that we talked about, and they're starting roughly the times that they started. And then here, if you remember, this is how we divided up the religious world in terms of followers. And Christianity has roughly a third. Islam has about a quarter of those who identify with a particular religion. And Eastern religions, you can see how those are divided up. Might give you an idea of the believing world, who believes what. That'll give you a sense for how that breaks down. And one of the themes that we focused on throughout these last several weeks has been what might be the most controversial statement that Jesus made, although he made quite a few. But this one in particular, just before his death, he said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. And for very many people, the idea that there is one and only one way to God has become a stumbling block. It's difficult to reconcile that with the sense that there must be many ways up the same mountain. We talked about that some, and that is an important idea. And I think we need to be prepared when people ask and have a knowledgeable answer to why it is. Why do we believe there's one and only one way? Christianity has traditionally taught that, the reason being that the way is the way of grace. God took the initiative, He stepped into history. He is the one, and He's the only one who could have solved the problem that has to do with reconciling human beings to Himself. And that grace was embodied at the cross. As Paul put it, he made him who knew no sin, that is Jesus, to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. it is truly a unique message. I think we talked about how early on I just thought that was Christian propaganda, but it's true. It is uniquely a religion that focuses on not what human beings are required to do, but what God did Himself in order to restore that relationship with humanity. And so that becomes really the focal point as we talk about Christianity. There's this quote from Jeffrey Parander. I'm just going to look at those words in bold. The differences between religions may be as significant as their similarities. Again, in our current climate, it's very tempting to take on the attitude that uh, really underneath all the maybe the traditions and the practices and the beliefs, there's some common core that all religions share. But to do that, you have to ignore many of the very significant differences. And one example we're going to look at is how Christianity and Islam differ very significantly. I don't know that either a Christian or a Muslim will be content to just sort of gloss over those differences as if they didn't matter at all, because they certainly do. So that also is one of the assumptions that we began with a few weeks ago as we started this study. We talked about the dangers of what's called the Procrustean bed. It's a Greek myth, and the moral of the story, if you will, is it's dangerous to make the facts fit the conclusion, and that's certainly true of many people's attitudes toward religion. That all of them essentially teach the same thing. There is a way, I believe, and I've tried to stress this over the last few weeks. There is a way to remain loyal to the one who said he is the way, the truth, and the life, while at the same time genuinely loving our neighbors who do not share our convictions. As Paul, again, how he said it, such confidence we have through Christ toward God. I do believe Christians are called to develop a steadfast confidence in the gospel, along with a sincere consideration for others who do not yet share our faith. I think those two ought to go hand in hand. And we did, over the last couple of months, we got a lot of mileage out of the example of the Apostle Paul, especially from Acts 17. He's the one who demonstrated how to effectively maintain dialogue with what we might call religious outsiders without compromising the truth of the gospel. We talked about how it was that um, Paul's regular practice as an apostle was to go straight to the synagogue in a given city. You might think about the 3 missionary journeys that he went on, and he would head straight to the synagogue because there, with like-minded Jewish brethren, he could assume they had a knowledge of the scriptures, which they did, and he could turn to the prophets and how they continually looked ahead to the time when God would send his Messiah. And so that's language that all of them understood. It was a different story when he came to Athens. He was surrounded by this Greek culture, and as a strict Pharisee, I'm sure it was very difficult for him to overcome his prejudices. It's the last place in the world he would have thought he would be because they avoided non-Jews and having contact with them in general. But here he was so intent on sharing the gospel with them. He made use of his extensive knowledge. He understood their culture. He was able to make connections as he quoted their poets, as he quoted their writers, and he answered the questions that are common to all of humanity. These weren't just Jewish questions. These were questions about life and death and the hereafter, and Paul addressed those. and he was insistent on the truth of the gospel. He never compromised that. But at the same time, he was very willing to build bridges with people from this very different culture from what he was used to. Elie Wiesel, I've always liked this quote, but reflecting on the events that led up to the Holocaust, he said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. Because of indifference, one dies before one actually dies." And as long as we're talking about what Christians are called to do, I think we could point to how one thing we can't do as Christians is to be indifferent to the situation our neighbors are in. We have to have a heart for them. We have to have concern for them. D.T. Niles, the famous preacher, evangelism is just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And I think one reason I like that quote is because it's a reminder that we're all in the same boat. We're not better or worse than anyone else. It's just we have found hope, and that hope is in Jesus, and that's something we want to share with our neighbors. Now, by way of review, I know this was somewhat ambitious, but trying to summarize a particular religion with just one word. I think with Judaism, it was fair to say that word would be covenant. That so much is spelled out in the covenant that God makes with Abraham. He's going to give him a great name, a people, and a land. And then there's that literally the bottom line of the covenant, and that is that through Abraham all the nations of the world would be blessed. And much of what you see played out in the history of Israel is, God is attempting to build a people, to assemble a people who would be His representatives in order to ultimately to bless everyone in the world. And that covenant at every turn is emphasized, and God promises that it will come about. When we turn to Christianity, Christianity sees itself, Christians understand themselves to be the ones who inherit all of these promises. Paul, in very picturesque language, talks about how we've been grafted into this tree, that all of Christianity is built on. The New Testament is built on the Old Testament. And really, if we were to find one word that would, I think, define this religion, it would be reconciliation. In terms of God, as we said, taking the initiative, making the first move in order to restore the relationship with humanity. And Christians believe that it was through the cross that Jesus took on the sins of the world. As his cousin John the Baptist said when he began his ministry, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And as they came upon the empty tomb, as pictured here, they went about with this very hopeful message, that God has accomplished all that needs done in order to restore that relationship with Him. And they went about with the confidence that because the tomb was empty, it confirmed every one of the promises that God had made in Jesus, that we could finally be reconciled with our Creator. Now, in the religion of Islam, the very name itself means submission, and the 5 pillars of Islam all have to do with the requirements of human beings to submit entirely to the will of Allah. We sometimes use that word inscrutable to describe, particularly within Islam, that there's no way to know fully or completely the mind of Allah. But what He has made known through the Quran is, this is what you're to follow. This is what you're to do in your daily life, and believing, word for word what the Quran says is the way to apply what He said to your life. But submission, I think, in a nutshell, describes that attitude towards Allah, one of surrender, complete surrender. When we turn to the Eastern religions, here are some important questions. I'm not going to read all four of them, but you can see it is a very different mindset. And so, in particular, if we were to go back and take a look at how C.S. Lewis describes it in Mere Christianity, it's a different way of looking at the divine, the nature of the divine, an impersonal ultimate reality. You might remember the story about a college kid comes home, the father wants to test him to see how much he's learned, and he shows him a jar full of water. He dissolves salt into it, and when he goes to look for the salt, of course it's invisible, but the phrase "that thou art" that's found in the Bhagavad Gita, the sense that you really and truly that you are one tiny speck of the divine universe, and following the yogic paths, whichever yogic path is right for you, its destination is enlightenment, to finally discover that truth for yourself. So, okay. Within Hinduism, I think one word that we would associate with, that's a hyphenated word, it's actually two words, self-realization, coming to that understanding of who you are in this universe. And this, I think, a yoga, um, a particular yogic path, it's intended to guide you to that full realization of who you are. And we talked a little bit about the Hare Krishnas, maybe not an ideal example of Hinduism in the modern world, but you do get the sense that as they chant the name of Krishna throughout the day, that's the way of devotion, and that's one of several paths. All of those paths, though, are leading to that one ultimate goal of self-realization. Buddhism, as you recall, Buddha himself was raised in a Hindu home and a Hindu environment, but in time, through his spiritual search, he got to the point where he rejected many of those beliefs and practices. He had little patience with priests and sacred scriptures and rituals. He said all of that sort of, in a way, missed the point, because the real point, as Buddha saw it, was to seek liberation. We're all trapped. All of us suffer, and the reason that we suffer, according to Buddha, is that we desire. And if only we would overcome that all-pervasive desire, then we would truly be free. We would be liberated. And the way to achieve that state of not desiring, not wanting, is to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's, Buddha descended from, Buddhism descended from Hinduism, but it does share in common the idea of karma and reincarnation, but it also has some very significant differences. When it comes to Taoism, we talked about how the very familiar symbol of yin and yang, two equal and opposite powers at work, and this is underlying the entire universe. This sense it explains why the universe is the way it is. And I think one example that we used was when we talked about Bruce Lee and his form of martial arts, which was thoroughly steeped in Taoist philosophy. The basic idea is that you work with the powers of nature rather than working against it, and that really is what Taoism is about at its heart, is seeking out that balanced unity and also seeking to adapt to it. I guess the way we would say it today would be go with the flow. That's very much a Taoist attitude, the idea of harmony, that there was an essential harmony in the beginning, and going back to that, returning to that, is the Taoist ideal. With Confucianism, I know that we barely scratched the surface of it, but Confucianism, again, might be more of a social and political philosophy than it is, truly a religion. But, to give you the short version, Confucius himself was faced with a society that was entirely in chaos, and he believed the best way to restore order was to have everybody take on their proper roles. And that would mean, children, you got to obey your parents. Subjects, you got to obey your rulers. And if we will just, get back to that original structure of society, then things will move smoothly. Now, there at the same time, there is a religious element to it, and that is really, it ought to sound familiar to Christians, and that is this idea of as in heaven, so on earth, that there is this sort of perfect model somewhere in the heavenly realms, and that's what society ought to emulate. Um, the one important idea to keep in mind is, especially in the East and in China, for example, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism can all coexist in harmony. It's not nearly as concerned with proper doctrine or dogma or beliefs as it is just in acting out in accordance with those principles. It's both and rather than either or much of the time. So with that, that'll summarize where we've been so far. And in the next video, I'm going to try to tie up some loose ends and talk a little bit in more detail about how do we approach those from other religions. What's the proper way to approach them? So I'll say so long for now.